So what if the reality that we experience every single day is just one channel on a TV that has, well, infinite stations? Today, we're going to dive into the mind of an author named Jim DeKorne. His book, Psychedelic Shamanism, is basically a logbook from a lifelong journey into those other channels, into non-ordinary states of reality, all in an attempt to map the very substructure of consciousness itself.
And right at the start of his book, DeKorne hits you with his powerful statement. It really sets the stage for everything he's about to argue. See, he's not just talking about plants or chemicals here. He's talking about what he sees as a fundamental human right, the right to explore our own inner worlds.
DeKorne basically believes our culture is in a state of what he calls pathological denial. He argues that by just labeling these incredible experiences as illusions or even madness, we're cutting ourselves off from the deepest parts of our own psyche. And he thinks that this denial has some really profound consequences, not just for us as individuals, but for the health of the entire planet.
So, you have to ask, how did he get to such a radical conclusion? Well, the heart of his book is a series of 12 deeply personal and, frankly, pretty bizarre life experiences. These are the raw data points he uses to build his whole hypothesis. So let's take a look at a few of the most important stories that started it all. Okay, but before we jump in, we need to understand a really critical concept. Set and setting. Your set is your mindset, your expectations going in. Your setting is your physical and social environment. DeKorne really stresses that these two things don't just influence an experience, he says they pretty much determine its nature. And this is perfectly illustrated by his first two encounters with LSD.
What you're seeing here are two extremes of the exact same coin. DeKorne's first trip back in 1964 was pure bliss. He describes it as samadhi, this state of total unity and integration. But his second trip, just a few months later, it was the polar opposite. A really poor setting, he was listening to a tape of his own voice reading an esoteric manual, plunged him into what he calls the hell multiverse, a state of just pure terror, where everything, including himself, felt like a total threat.
The lesson he took from this absolutely terrifying contrast was profound. As he puts it, I've seen the world from both sides now. He realized that reality wasn't this fixed, solid thing. It could be perceived as either this seamless, beautiful unity or as fragmented, terrifying fear. And after having survived the absolute worst his mind could throw at him, he felt like it freed him from ever needing to fear anything again.
But, DeKorne's explorations weren't limited to just chemicals. One night in 1968, after reading a book on astral projection, he just decided, kind of on a whim, to give it a try. What happened next challenged the very foundations of his entire materialist worldview. He describes this hyper-real experience of floating above his own sleeping body and actually interacting with other entities. For him, this was absolutely not a dream. The takeaway was, well, it was earth-shattering. He concluded that our consciousness is not necessarily stuck inside our brain or body. He says that this one experience instantly reduced the whole materialist position to just a partial truth at best. And then things got even stranger. This is a drawing of a pretty unique silver Coptic cross that's an ancient Christian symbol from Egypt that his wife had given him. He lost it in Santa Fe in 1970. 2 years later, in a completely different state, while he was going through this period of excruciating pain from cluster headaches, he walked into his bedroom and found it lying right in the middle of the floor. And it had not been there just minutes before. He and his wife could find absolutely no rational explanation for how it appeared, so he was left with a question. Was it a hallucination, maybe brought on by the intense pain? Or did the intense psychological stress, as some paranormal researchers have suggested, actually allow his mind to interact with matter in a way that just transcends our understanding of space and time?
This leads us to another really key concept that DeKorne leans on to try and make sense of his experiences: synchronicity. It was coined by the psychologist Carl Jung, and it's a term for those meaningful coincidences that seem to connect our inner, subjective world with the outer, objective world.
And this next story is a brilliant illustration of this idea. As DeKorne was leaving San Francisco to move to New Mexico, a rare sparrowhawk landed on a wire right above his Jeep. To him, it felt like this powerful omen. 3 days later, the very moment he arrived at his new home hundreds of miles away, a friend comes out of the house to greet him, holding a hawk bolo tie he had just finished making. For DeKorne, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a sign that hidden forces can symbolically mirror our own subjective journey.
So after decades of these kinds of, well, anomalous experiences, out-of-body travel, terrifying visions, impossible objects appearing out of thin air, what do you do with all that? How do you possibly put it all together into a coherent worldview? Well, DeKorne distills it down into several core lessons. First, his out-of-body experience taught him that consciousness is not confined to the physical body. Second, he concluded that time isn't fixed. He describes another experience where he lived an entire lifetime in the few seconds he was unconscious. Third, the mystery of that Coptic cross suggested to him that the mind can actually affect the material world. And finally, he came to believe that these powerful, archetypal forces can influence our actions for reasons that are way beyond our immediate understanding.
These experiences, along with repeated encounters with what he calls entities of the imaginal realm, led him to a really provocative question. Are we actually alone in our reality? I mean, are there other intelligences, other dimensions, just existing right beyond the veil of our normal perception?
And this is the culmination of his journey. All of these weird, anomalous data points led him to formulate what he calls the shamanic hypothesis, a whole new model for reality that could actually account for the profound weirdness that he had witnessed firsthand.
So let's break down the key ideas. DeKorne proposes that the human psyche is multidimensional, and that it actually transcends our physical existence. He argues our ego isn't the center of our being, but just one small part of a much bigger reality. In this model, space and time as we know them, they're only a partial reality. He sees consciousness itself as a form of energy, and maybe most radically, he suggests that in these other dimensions, our thoughts can be actual physical entities. This is a complete and total departure from the standard materialist view of the world.
Now, DeKorne is very careful to distinguish this kind of serious exploration from recreational drug use. He even quotes his fellow psychonaut Terence McKenna to kind of reframe the whole conversation. The argument here is that these substances, when used correctly, are tools for breaking harmful, unexamined habits, mainly by forcing us into a wider, less egocentric point of view. It is really important to remember, what we're explaining here is Jim DeKorne's personal journey and the hypothesis that came out of it. This is his map, drawn from his own experiences, in an attempt to make sense of the deeply strange and paranormal corners of human awareness. And this brings us right back around to that powerful quote from the very beginning. DeKorne's whole journey leads him to this fundamental question for all of us. He frames the prohibition of these states not just as a legal issue, but as a deep cultural sickness, a denial of who we truly are. So the question he leaves us with is this: is exploring these inner realms a dangerous delusion, or is it a fundamental part of the human experience that we've simply chosen to forget?